Normandy, France, June 6, 1944. 6:30 a.m. The largest amphibious invasion in history is underway. 5,000 ships cross the English Channel. 11,000 aircraft fill the sky. 156,000 soldiers prepare to storm 5 beaches along the coast of Normandy. The operation has been planned for 2 years. The fate of Europe depends on its success, and it is failing. On Omaha Beach, American soldiers are being cut down before they reach the shore. The landing craft doors open. Machine gun fire rakes the boats. Men fall into the water, weighed down by their equipment, and drown. Bodies float in the surf. The beach is covered with the dead and dying. The cliffs above are lined with German bunkers. Every gun is firing. Every position is intact. The pre-invasion bombardment has failed. The German defenses are untouched. On Utah Beach, paratroopers have been scattered across the countryside. They cannot link up with the landing forces. German counterattacks are pushing the beachhead back into the sea. On Gold, Juno and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces are pinned down. They cannot advance beyond the beach. German reinforcements are arriving. Panzer divisions are moving toward the coast. The invasion is stalling. By noon, the situation is desperate. Casualties are catastrophic. The beachheads are shallow, fragmented and vulnerable. German artillery is destroying landing craft before they can unload. Supplies are piling up on the beaches, burning under shell fire. Commanders are radioing back to England. The invasion is failing. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, faces the most difficult decision of his life. Does he commit more forces to a failing operation, or does he order a withdrawal? This did not happen. D-Day succeeded. Against heavy casualties, against fierce resistance, against tactical setbacks, the Allied forces established a foothold in Normandy. They held the beaches. They expanded the beachheads. Within a week, they had landed over 300 surrounded soldiers. By the end of August, Paris was liberated. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. But it could have gone differently. The success of D-Day was not inevitable. It depended on weather, timing, deception, German mistakes, and the courage of individual soldiers who advanced when every instinct told them to take cover. A few different decisions, a few turns of luck, and the invasion could have failed. Not completely, not absolutely, but enough. Enough to force a withdrawal. Enough to delay the liberation of Europe, enough to change the course of the war. So let us imagine that on June 6, 1944, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Let us imagine that the Normandy landing was a complete failure, that the Allies were driven back into the sea, that thousands died on the beaches and nothing was gained. What would have happened next? How would the war have changed? Would the Allies have tried again? Would Germany have won? Would the world be different today? This is not alternate history for its own sake. This is a way to understand what actually happened by imagining what might have happened, a way to see how close the invasion came to failure, a way to appreciate the decisions, sacrifices, and moments of chance that made success possible. Let us imagine the failure, and then let us see what it reveals about the success. To understand how D-Day could have failed, we must first understand how close it came to failing in reality. The planning for D-Day began in 1942. The Allies knew that to defeat Germany, they had to invade France. They had to open a second front in the West to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. They had to liberate Europe. And they had to do it by launching the largest amphibious assault in history across the English Channel against fortified German positions. The challenges were enormous. The English Channel is one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world. Tides are extreme. Weather is unpredictable. Currents are strong. Landing thousands of troops on a hostile shore requires precise coordination, overwhelming firepower, and absolute surprise. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. They did not know where or when, but they knew it would come. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was placed in command of defending the French coast. He inspected the Atlantic Wall, the system of bunkers, obstacles, and fortifications the Germans had been building since 1942. He found it inadequate. He ordered more obstacles placed on the beaches. He ordered more mines laid. He ordered artillery positioned to cover every landing site. He believed that the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches. If the Allies gained a foothold, German reinforcements would arrive too late. Rommel wanted the panzer divisions positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack immediately. But his superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, disagreed. He believed the panzers should be held in reserve inland, waiting until the Allies revealed their main objective. Hitler, characteristically, compromised in the worst possible way. He placed some panzer divisions under Rommel's command, some under Rundstedt's, and some under his own direct control, meaning they could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. The Allies, meanwhile, prepared the most elaborate deception operation in history. Operation Fortitude convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest part of the Channel, not at Normandy. Fake armies were created in England. Dummy tanks and landing craft were positioned where German reconnaissance could see them. Double agents fed false information to German intelligence. The deception worked. Even after D-Day began, the Germans believed Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion would come later at Calais. They held their reserves back, waiting for an attack that never came. The invasion was scheduled for June 5, 1944. But the weather was terrible. High winds, heavy seas, low clouds. Eisenhower postponed the invasion by 24 hours. His meteorologists predicted a brief break in the weather on June 6th. It would not be ideal, but it would be good enough. Eisenhower made the decision. The invasion would go on June 6th. If he postponed again, the tides would not be right for another month. The troops were ready, the ships were loaded. Delay meant giving the Germans more time to prepare. Eisenhower decided to risk it. In the early hours of June 6th, paratroopers and glider troops were dropped behind enemy lines to secure key bridges and disrupt German communications. Many were scattered. Some landed miles from their objectives. Some drowned in flooded fields. But enough landed in the right places to cause confusion and delay German responses. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers fired on German positions. Bombers attacked coastal defenses, but the bombardment was less effective than hoped. Many bombs fell inland, missing the beach defenses. The Germans, dug into reinforced concrete bunkers, survived. And when the landing craft approached the shore, those bunkers opened fire. On Omaha Beach, the situation was catastrophic. The naval bombardment had missed most of the German defenses. The bombers had missed. The German 352nd Infantry Division, a combat-experienced unit, was positioned on the bluffs overlooking the beach. They had clear fields of fire. They had pre-registered artillery. They had machine guns covering every approach. The first wave of American soldiers was slaughtered. Landing craft were hit before they reached the shore. Men jumped into water over their heads and drowned. Those who made it to the beach found no cover. The obstacles Rommel had placed, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, mines, were still intact. Engineers trying to clear them were killed. Tanks that were supposed to support the infantry sank in the rough seas. Within the first hour, over 2 Zero Americans were killed or wounded on Omaha Beach. For several hours, it seemed the landing would fail. Officers were killed, units were leaderless. Soldiers huddled behind the seawall, pinned down by fire, but gradually, small groups began to move. A few officers rallied their men. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore and fired directly at German bunkers. Soldiers found gaps in the defenses and worked their way up the bluffs. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had gained a foothold. By evening, they had pushed inland. Omaha Beach was secured, but at terrible cost. On the other beaches, the situation was better. Utah beach landings were scattered but faced lighter resistance. British and Canadian forces on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches fought through obstacles and established beachheads. By the end of the day, 1:56, Zhuo's Allied soldiers were ashore. Casualties were around 10, Zhuo's heavy, but far less than the 50, Zhuo's to 100, Zhuo's some planners had feared. The invasion succeeded, but it came close to failing. If the weather had been worse, landing craft might not have made it across. If the Germans had positioned their panzers closer to the coast, counterattacks might have driven the Allies back. If Rommel had been at his headquarters, instead of visiting his wife in Germany, he might have reacted faster. If Hitler had been awake when the invasion began and authorized the release of panzer reserves immediately, the outcome might have been different. So let us imagine that those things happened. Let us imagine that every advantage the Allies had was lost. Let us imagine that D-Day was a complete failure. Imagine that the weather on June 6th is worse than predicted. The brief break never comes. Seas are too rough for landing craft. Paratroopers are scattered even more widely, landing in the wrong zones, unable to organize. The naval bombardment is ineffective. Visibility is so poor that bombers cannot see their targets. Most bombs fall harmlessly into empty fields. Imagine that Rommel is at his headquarters when the invasion begins. He immediately orders his panzer divisions to move toward the coast. Hitler, for once, is awake and approves the release of reserves. By noon, German tanks are arriving at the beachheads. Imagine that the German 352nd Division at Omaha Beach is reinforced by another division, that the defenses are even stronger, that the machine gun fire is even more devastating, that the first 3 waves of American soldiers are annihilated before reaching the shore. Imagine that on Utah Beach, the paratroopers fail to secure the causeways. German forces counterattack in strength, driving the landing forces back to the water. Imagine that on Gold, Juno and Sword, British and Canadian forces are pinned on the beaches, unable to advance, taking heavy casualties from German artillery. By midday, the situation is catastrophic. Casualties exceed 30 Zhuo's. No beachhead is deeper than a few hundred yards. Landing craft are being destroyed faster than they can unload. Supplies are burning on the beaches. German reinforcements are arriving in strength. Panzer divisions are preparing to counterattack. Eisenhower receives the reports. His commanders are telling him the invasion is failing. Some beachheads may have to be evacuated. The decision is his. Does he commit the reserves? Does he send more men into a failing operation? Or does he order a withdrawal and accept that D-Day has been a disaster? If Eisenhower orders a withdrawal, the result is a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of soldiers must be evacuated under fire. Landing craft and ships crowd the beaches, vulnerable to German artillery and air attack. Rear guards fight desperate battles to hold perimeters while the evacuation proceeds. The scenes resemble Dunkirk in 1940, but worse. Many soldiers are left behind, killed or captured. The losses are staggering: 50 Zhuo's casualties, hundreds of ships and landing craft destroyed. The cream of the American, British and Canadian armies decimated. The news reaches the world. D-Day has failed. The Allies have been driven back into the sea. The invasion of Europe has been repulsed. Germany claims a great victory. Goebbels' propaganda machine proclaims that the Atlantic Wall is invincible, that the Allies lack the will and capability to defeat Germany, that the Reich will triumph. What happens next? The immediate political consequences are severe. In Britain, Churchill faces a crisis. He has staked his government on the success of the invasion. The failure is a catastrophe. There are calls for his resignation. Some politicians argue that Britain should seek a negotiated peace with Germany. Churchill refuses. He gives a speech in Parliament invoking the spirit of 1940, reminding Britain that it has endured worse. He vows that the Allies will try again, but his political position is weakened. In the United States, Roosevelt faces similar pressure. The 1944 presidential election is only 5 months away. His opponent will argue that Roosevelt's strategy has failed, that American boys have been sent to die in a futile invasion, that a change in leadership is needed. Roosevelt, like Churchill, refuses to consider negotiations. But the political cost is real. In the Soviet Union, Stalin is furious. He's been demanding a second front in the West since 1941. The Allies promised it would come in 1944. Now it has failed. Stalin suspects that the Western Allies deliberately sabotaged the invasion to allow Germany and the Soviet Union to bleed each other dry. Trust between the Allies, already fragile, deteriorates further. In Germany, Hitler is triumphant. He claims that his leadership, his insistence on fortifying the Atlantic Wall, his decision to hold panzer reserves, has saved Germany. He argues that the Allies are weak, that their democracies lack the stomach for hard fighting, that Germany can still win the war. Morale in Germany, which had been declining after years of defeats in the East and relentless bombing in the West, is temporarily restored, but the strategic situation has not fundamentally changed. Germany is still losing the war. In the East, the Red Army is advancing. In June 1944, the Soviets launch Operation Bagration, the largest offensive of the war, destroying Army Group Center and driving the Germans out of Belarus. By August, the Red Army is approaching Warsaw. By September, it is entering the Balkans. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The failure of D-Day does not stop the Soviet advance. If anything, it accelerates it. Without a second front in the West, Germany can concentrate more forces in the East, but it is not enough. The Red Army is larger, better equipped, and gaining experience. The German army is exhausted. Casualties are unsustainable. Oil is running out. The Luftwaffe is being destroyed by Allied bombing and attrition. Germany cannot win. It can only delay defeat. So the Allies must try again. They have no choice. If they do not invade France, the Red Army will liberate all of Europe alone, and a Europe liberated solely by the Soviet Union will be a Europe dominated by Stalin. The Western Allies cannot accept that. They must invade. They must open a second front. They must reach Germany before the Soviets do. But when and where? After the failure of D-Day, the Allies must rebuild. The casualties must be replaced. New units must be trained. New equipment must be produced. The invasion fleet must be repaired. Morale must be restored. And a new plan must be developed. The earliest a second invasion could be attempted is spring 1945. That gives the Allies 9 months to prepare, but it also gives the Germans 9 months to strengthen their defenses. Rommel, vindicated by his success on June 6th, is given more authority. He orders even more extensive fortifications, more obstacles on the beaches, more minefields, more artillery, more troops. The Atlantic Wall becomes stronger than ever. The Allies must choose a new landing site. Normandy is no longer an option. The Germans will expect another attempt there. The Allies consider several alternatives. Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing but the most heavily defended. The Germans expect an invasion there. The defenses are formidable, but the Allies could concentrate overwhelming force, and once ashore, the distance to Germany is shorter. Brittany, farther from Germany but less defended. The Allies could capture the ports of Brest and Saint-Nazaire, providing supply bases. But the peninsula could be isolated and contained. Southern France, Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, was historically launched in August 1944. If D-Day had failed, the Allies might prioritize a landing in the south, driving up the Rhone Valley toward Germany. But this route is longer and more difficult. Norway. Some strategists propose invading Norway, cutting off German access to Swedish iron ore and threatening Germany from the north. But the terrain is difficult, the distance is vast, and the strategic value questionable. In the end, the Allies likely choose Pas-de-Calais. It is the most direct route. Despite the defences, the Allies have learned from the failure of D-Day. They commit even larger forces, more naval bombardment, more air support, better coordination. They learn from their mistakes. Imagine the second invasion launches in May 1945. This time, the Allies commit 200,000 Russian troops in the first wave. The bombardment lasts for days, not hours. Every German bunker is targeted repeatedly. The defences, though strong, are overwhelmed by sheer firepower. The invasion succeeds. The Allies establish a beachhead. They push inland. But by May 1945, the war is nearly over, not because of the Western Allies, because of the Soviets. While the Western Allies spent 9 months preparing for a second invasion, the Red Army advanced hundreds of miles. By the end of 1944, the Soviets liberated Poland. By January 1945, they entered Germany. By April 1945, they reached Berlin. If D-Day had failed, the Soviet Union would have liberated all of Europe east of the Rhine. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Austria, and Eastern Germany would fall under Soviet control. Perhaps even France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, if the Red Army advanced far enough before the Western Allies landed. The Iron Curtain would not fall at the Elbe River, as it did in reality. It would fall at the Rhine or the Atlantic. The Cold War would be colder, the Soviet sphere larger, the balance of power more tilted toward Moscow. This is the real consequence of a failed D-Day. Not that Germany would win the war. Germany was already losing. But that the Soviet Union would win the peace. The map of post-war Europe would be redrawn. Millions more people would live under communist rule. The Western Allies would have less leverage in negotiations. Stalin would dictate terms. And what of Germany? With or without D-Day, Germany was doomed. The Red Army would have taken Berlin. Hitler would have committed suicide. The Nazi regime would have collapsed, but the timeline might have been different. If the Western Allies did not invade until 1945, the war in Europe might have lasted a few months longer. More people would have died in concentration camps. More cities would have been destroyed. More soldiers would have been killed in the final battles. And the atomic bomb, successfully tested in July 1945, might have been used in Europe instead of Japan. If the war dragged on, if the Allies needed to force a German surrender, Truman might have authorized its use on a German city: Hamburg, Munich, Berlin. The first atomic bomb might have fallen not on Hiroshima, but on Germany. Let us return to June 6, 1944, to the beaches of Normandy, to the soldiers who landed that morning, knowing that many of them would not survive the day. D-Day succeeded because of their courage. Because when the landing craft doors opened and machine gun fire raked the boats, they went forward anyway. Because when their officers were killed, they took command themselves. Because when the situation seemed hopeless, they found a way. It succeeded because of the sailors who brought them across the channel in terrible weather. Because of the pilots who flew through flak to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines. Because of the planners who spent 2 years preparing every detail. Because of the deception operations that convinced the Germans the invasion would come somewhere else. Because of the intelligence operatives who broke German codes and read their communications. It succeeded because of luck. Because the weather cleared just enough. Because Rommel was away from his headquarters, because Hitler was asleep and did not authorize panzer reserves until it was too late, because the German High Command believed Normandy was a diversion, and it succeeded because the Allies had the industrial capacity, the manpower and the will to sustain an operation of that scale. Because Britain, the United States and Canada worked together, because they built the ships, trained the soldiers, produced the weapons, and committed the resources necessary. D-Day could have failed. The margin between success and failure was narrow. A few different decisions, a few unlucky breaks, and the invasion would have been repulsed. The Allies would have been driven back into the sea. Tens of thousands would have died. The liberation of Europe would have been delayed. The Soviet Union would have dominated the post-war world even more than it did. But D-Day did not fail. It succeeded. And because it succeeded, the war ended a year later. Western Europe was liberated. Democracy was preserved. The Iron Curtain fell in the middle of Germany, not on the Atlantic coast. That is what was at stake on June 6, 1944. That is why D-Day mattered, not because success was inevitable, but because failure was possible, and the consequences of failure would have been catastrophic. So when we ask, what if D-Day had been a complete failure? The answer is clear. The war would have lasted longer. More people would have died. The Soviet Union would have controlled more of Europe. The balance of power would have shifted, and the world we live in today would be very different. But it did not fail. The soldiers who landed on those beaches succeeded, and because they succeeded, Europe was freed, democracy survived, and the world, though scarred by war, had a chance to rebuild. That is the lesson of D-Day. Not that success was easy, but that it was possible, that ordinary men facing extraordinary odds could achieve the impossible, that courage, planning and sacrifice could overcome even the most formidable defenses. D-Day succeeded. And because it succeeded, we live in a freer world. Imagine if it had failed, and then be grateful that it did not.